This is the Wisdom Podcast.
Welcome to the Wisdom Podcast. My name is Daniel Aitken. I'm the Associate Publisher of Wisdom, and we had such an amazing response to our first episode with His Holiness the Karmapa, and so I wanted to thank everyone for their tremendous support. And of course, you can subscribe to the Wisdom Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your podcasting apps. So today we have an interesting guest for you, Elijah Ari. He was the first Westerner recognized as the reincarnation of a Tibetan master in the Dalai Lama's lineage. In this episode, Elijah talks about remembering his past life, what it was like when he was a child and trying to tell everyone that he remembers being in Tibet. So he tells us about that. He talks about going back to Tibet, what it was like going back to a place he'd never been to but felt like he knew. And also he talks about studying in a Tibetan monastery. Elijah went to Sarah Monastery in India. And then from Sarah, he went to Harvard. So he talks about what it was like to go from a Tibetan monastery to the hollowed halls of Harvard. His PhD, which was been recently published by Wisdom as Authorized Lives, looks at the secret biographies of Tsongkhapa and tells the story of how Tsongkhapa's life has changed over time, or really the telling of Tsongkhapa's life, how that has changed over time. It was such a great pleasure to interview Elijah. He not only has a fascinating life story, but he's such an interesting guy and such a clear thinker. We had a great time recording, and so I hope you really enjoy this interview. If you could tell us the story of your entry into Tibetan Buddhism. It's quite an interesting one.
My entry into Tibetan Buddhism. It's an interesting way of putting it. I always kind of make reference to, there's the French comic, a series of French comic books, Asterix and Obelix. And Obelix sort of fell in the cauldron of magic potion when he was born, and so I always make reference to that, saying I was kind of born in the cauldron. My parents became Buddhist. Well, to hear my father tell it, it was 9 months before I was born. To hear my mother tell it, it's probably likely a year or so. But it was around that time, so it was about a year before I was born. My parents, who were part of the hippie movement at the time, as many people were, became Buddhists. They became Buddhists after meeting Kalu Rinpoche, actually. So they became Buddhists, and then shortly thereafter I was born. And my parents, I was born in Vancouver, so west coast of Canada, and my parents are both from the east coast of Canada originally, and both my sisters are. So it was a weird situation where if they went out, I was born, then they came back afterwards. And when they came back, when they came back to Montreal, they decided, I don't know how long after we returned that they decided this, but they decided that they wanted to create a Dharma center. So a Buddhist center, a place where people could gather and practice together and hear teachings in Montreal. And so they did that from our home. So our home became a Buddhist center.
Oh. Is that center still going? Or?
No, the center has ceased to exist. It's kind of I guess there's it's transformed into some other center now, in some ways. But the original center, well, it did transform in that center. Then again transformed.
It's not Rigpa Dorje.
So, pardon?
It's not Rigpa Dorje Center, is it?
Well, the original of Rigpa Dorje. So there was Rigpa Dorje, and then when Rigpa Dorje first started, that was kind of a spin-off. It was, and it took over from the Milarepa Dharma Center. Was the center that my parents were running. So the Milarepa Dharma Center in Montreal eventually sort of started to fizzle out, and then Rigby Dorje Center sort of grew around the same time. So you can't really see from the ashes, and it wasn't exactly that. But I think the Rigby Dorje Center was set up by my cousin Judy Cutler, who still runs the place now. And Judy, so Judy is my cousin. We're kind of distant cousins, but we're cousins. We're basically, I grew up wearing her son's clothes because he's a little bit older than me. And so I actually just saw her in Montreal recently. But so the Rigby Dorje Center, was started by Judy, and Judy used to come to the center that my father started. So I grew up really in a Buddhist environment. I really did grow up in a Buddhist environment. My parents were students of Kala Rinpoche, but they were very open-minded. They really wanted they wanted the center to be Rime in the sense of really non-sectarian, not just in the sense of the traditional Rime tradition, and in doing that, they basically invited all of these different teachers. So we had the His Holiness 16th Karmapa come to our house. We had Shama Rinpoche came, Situ Rinpoche came, Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche came. We had at the same time Ling Rinpoche and His Holiness 16th Karmapa together.
Really,
and there are photos of them sort of arm wrestling almost on the couch at our house.
Fantastic.
And
how old were you at this time?
It was. I don't remember when we. I was young enough that I don't remember when we moved into that house. But I think we left when I was about 9 or 10 from that. So I really did grow up. The center, I think, lasted a number of years there, and so we had teachers. One of the ex Ganden Tripas came to teach as well. There was a Geshe Karab from Ganden Jangtse who lived in Montreal at the time, and he used to come once in a while as well. He had his own center, but he used to come once in a while and teach as well. And when he invited people, my parents would invite, as a center, would invite that teacher over as well. So we always had teachers in our house almost. So it was really. Really incredible experience for as a child to grow up in that kind of a Buddhist surrounding. I mean, there were a lot of other things happening because it's a Dharma center. There's always like you get these weird people showing up, but though I probably shouldn't say weird people. I mean, you get some people who are you always get these it was the old Dharma center, and I'm sure it's still that way to some extent, but it was very interesting in that sense, and so I had exposure to all these different teachers. But what happened was when I was about 4 years old, Geshe Khenrab from the Tibetan community, who was from Ganejantse, invited Khyentse Rinpoche Magyaltsen, who was one of the ex-abbots of Drepung. He invited him to Montreal, and Khyentse Rinpoche Magyaltsen gave some teachings. And so my parents invited him to our house and to give some teachings and to have lunch. And so he did that. He came over, and that was the beginning of what would be the rest of my life, so to speak. It was he came over, and after he left, he actually forgot his glasses at our house. And that's an important little detail in the end. But he left. My father went to drive him back, him and Geshe Khenrab back to where they were staying. And that's when I started to have recollections. So I started to I asked my mother, who is this person? Who was that man? And she said, well, that's Khyentse Rinpoche Magyaltsen, and he's a geshe, he's a teacher, and so he's a geshe. And she started to explain it a little bit to me in the way that she could to a 4-year-old child. And I looked at her and I said, I have a geshe too, and my geshe's name is Geshe Konawa. And I started to relate all of these details that she thought were just really, really cute. She thought, oh, he's our son's Buddhist. and that I had a very vivid imagination. And so, she put us to bed for a nap, and, we were 3 at that time. So I went to sleep. My father realized that Khenso Pema Gyatsen had forgotten his glasses. So my father drove all the way back to the house to get, to pick up the glasses so that he could bring them back, so that Khenso Pema Gyatsen would have them. And while he was at home, my mother said, "Oh, you have to hear what our son said." And she basically told my father, and he thought that was really cute and everything. And so he went back, brought the glasses, and he said, "Oh, by the way," he told Khenso Pema Gyatsen, "by the way, you really made quite an impression on my son because he said this afterwards." And Khenso Pema Gyatsen sat up and said, "What?"
Wow. So Khenso Pema Gyatsen, like, it was meeting with him that sort of sparked something? Yeah.
It was the meeting with Khenso Pema Gyatsen that sparked the memories.
Yeah.
That really sparked the entire pre-recognition process.
Wow.
And basically, I started to have memories. I started to speak about having teachers, having friends, the place where I lived, and in great detail. And I was basically describing Sarah in Tibet. And for the longest time, we couldn't figure out why I had spoken to Khenso, once, why Khenso Pema Gyatsen sparked the memories, and not, for example, Geshe Khenrab, who was in Montreal, who I knew as a child, even younger.
Yes.
None of that came up with him. And I only found out later when I actually went to Tibet for the first time. And I went to Sarah, and when I got to the Kangtsen that my predecessor had lived at, it turns out there was an elderly monk doing prostrations in the temple, and I had actually walked in. It said on the door, "Der Chunje Me." There is, no visitors, please, sort of. But it's just said it in Tibetan, and I walked in, which is very counter nature, for me at that time. And I walked in, and I went up into the temple, and he kind of looked at me and my wife, and I could see that, there was this, oh no, the Westerners didn't read they can't read the sign, sort of on his face. And so I just sort of went around. He was doing prostration, so I let him do his practice, and I was walking around and everything. And afterwards we got to talking, and my wife couldn't help herself. She said, "Do you have any pictures of Geshe Gyatse, who had been my predecessor?" Yes. And he said, "Oh, yes, there is one picture of him." And he brought us to this pillar, and there's this tiny little picture in the corner, a black and white picture. Yeah. There's only one picture that remains of him, actually. But he pointed out that was, that this was Geshe Gyatse, and he said, yes. He said Geshe Gyatse was my teacher, and he said Geshe Gyatse's reincarnation lives in North America. And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, "Oh," he said, "You know him?" And I said, I couldn't help it. I said a little. "Oh, you know him?" I said a little. He said, "Well, maybe, can you tell me where he is?" And I said, "Yeah, he's standing in front of you."
Wow.
And he burst into tears.
Wow.
It was an extremely touching moment. And he said, at that time, "I was the one responsible for your body when you passed away." He said, "I never thought I would see you again."
Wow.
So I reconnected with him, and then I got to ask him all sorts of questions, actually, because no one really knew much about. They knew stories about Geshe Gyatse, but no one in India really knew that much about him.
Yes.
And here was someone from his village, from his original village in Kham, and who knew him quite well. Yeah. So I asked him in the end. I said, why do you think? I said, why do you think, of all people that I had met, Khenso Pema Gyatsen would have sparked the memories? Mm-hmm. And he said, "Oh, that's easy. You did your Geshe degree together."
Really?
So apparently we were actually really good friends, and we did our Tlarampa together.
Wow.
So my predecessor, I should say, my predecessor and Khenso Pema Gyatsen had done their Tlarampa degree together in Tibet.
All these connections.
So,
it gives
yeah.
me goosebumps. I can't imagine how that must feel for you to be in Tibet. And how does that feel? And also when you see the picture of your predecessor, what's that like?
The picture, I mean, I don't know. Maybe now when I look at it, I've seen it so many times that I don't really, I don't really, it doesn't really do anything as much as it did. The first time I saw it, I was looking at it and I didn't really feel a feeling of, oh yeah, that was me. Yet there was something there.
Yeah.
There's something more than, it's like, it's a kind of a deja vu feeling. And the interesting thing is when I went back to Sarah for the first time,
Tibet Sarah.
Yeah. When I went back to Tibet Sarah, for the first time, it wasn't a déjà vu. It was déjà vu means already seen in French, right? The vu part. It was for me a déjà vécu. Vécu means lived, so already something that I've already experienced.
Yeah,
and so that's what it was like when I went. I felt. As I was walking up towards the monastery, the long alleyway that goes, this long central path that goes up to the monastery, it really felt as though my feet had already walked that road before. It felt that everywhere I went, it felt that it was very, very familiar, but it was familiar in a strange, almost physical way.
Yeah.
And I found my kansen. And
what's your kansen?
Lawa kansen. So I found the kansen that hadn't been destroyed, and luckily, and visited just naturally visited all of the temples that my predecessor had spent time at. I didn't have a map of Sarah, so I was
you should feel your way around.
Yeah, it really was like that. It just happened naturally. So it was a very, very strong experience that first time I went there.
Amazing, that connection with Khyentse Rinpoche.
Yeah. Well, I spoke with Khyentse Prema Gyaltsen. Khyentse Prema Gyaltsen seemed very happy, and I'm pretty sure that he felt that it was clear that I was a reincarnation, clear that I was a Tulku, but he didn't know of whom, because my predecessor's teacher, Geshe Konowa, had a lot of students.
Yeah.
And so what Khyentse Prema Gyaltsen, I found this out later, what he did, he had to compile a list of Geshe Konowa's students, and then take out those who were still alive, of course, and then so you remove those from the list, and then remove from the list of defunct Geshe Konowa students, remove those who had already been recognized as reincarnations, and then there was a list of those who were left over, and so. Contrary to what's usually done, where you have a number of children as candidates for one reincarnation position, if you can call it that. It was one child, and they were trying to figure out who I was a reincarnation of.
Wow, is that different because you sort of self-recognized in a way then? Yeah. So then that's a different process.
It's that, and I think it's a different process, and also they weren't looking for. If they weren't really looking for me, I was looking for Geshe Jetse's reincarnation. It had been quite some time because Geshe Jetse passed away circa 1956, I think.
Yeah.
From what I've been able to glean from the stories. And I'm born in 1972.
Oh, okay. So there's quite a gap.
So there is quite a gap.
And how's that explained? Is that was there previous incarnation in between, or Pure Land?
Some people say, yeah. Some people talk about Pure Land, but there's one of Geshe Jetse's old disciples who was at Sarah in India. Told me a story that he about 10 or so months after Geshe Jetse passed away, he had a dream in which he saw Geshe Jetse walking. So Geshe Jetse was his teacher. One was his sort of Peche Gigen, so his philosophical teacher, textual teacher, and so he saw Geshe Jetse walking along a pathway near Sarah, and he asked him. He said, in the standard Tibetan greeting, "Where are you going?" So he asked him where he was going, and Geshe Jetse said, "Oh, I'm going to Tashilompo. Do you want to come?" And he said, "Well, I'd like to, but I have to ask permission from my home from my home teacher first, and Geshe Jetsu responded, "You do whatever you like, but that's where I'm going."
Wow.
And then the dream ended. And he didn't think much of the dream until when I was born. My parents were actually close with Lama Garma Tende Rinpoche from the Toronto area, or who had a center in the Toronto area, and apparently this is what my parents told me. When I was born, my father called him up, and they said, Rinpoche, a son. We've had a son, and he said, "Yes, I know. He's a lama. Keep him clean." And he gave me the name Chashilumpo.
Really?
Of all names, of all things that you could call a child.
That connected to that dream.
So yeah, and so when this ex-disciple of my predecessor found out that my first Tibetan name was Treshilampo, it suddenly made that connection
for him.
Yeah. So he was saying that it's possible that maybe there was an intermediate incarnation between being Geshe Jetsu but that would have happened close to 1959.
Exactly.
And so things could have gotten a little bit rough.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Especially if the child had gone to study, say, in Treshilampo, then it would have been a little bit difficult, I think.
Wow.
So nobody really knows.
Yeah.
But there are hypotheses.
Yeah. Wow, that's such a strong. All those jigsaw puzzles, those lamas have to find out who you were.
Yeah.
You knew you were someone.
And I think the connections actually are kind of one of the reasons why I say when people ask me, do you believe that you're a reincarnation? I always say that if a better explanation could come along that's plausible, then I would probably believe that.
Yes.
But the most plausible explanation for all the things that have happened throughout my life, and all the connections and all the so-called coincidences, is reincarnation right now.
Yeah.
And the fact that I still remember having the memories. So.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember having the memories, and I know what I felt when I went to Sarah in Tibet for the first time. Even the way I felt when I went to Sarah in India the first time.
Yeah.
And so for me, this is sort of one of the. It really is one of the most plausible explanations.
Yeah. When you're talking about people, that you have never had contact with, and you're 4 years old.
Yeah.
That's pretty compelling stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And using Tibetan words.
So you was like speaking Tibetan as well?
I was using Tibetan. Yeah, I was giving Tibetan names, very specific names, yeah.
Wow, amazing. And so then, how interesting. Your parents are Kagyu, yeah?
Yeah.
They have a Geluk Tulku born into their family.
Exactly,
That's a nice little, if you want to go rimming.
Yeah, I've never been one for conventions, I think.
That's fantastic. I love that. And so then I have to ask the question, why the West, do you think? Why born in the West?
I think that...
Rather than India or...
Well, if I had been born in India, I'm sure my life would be different. I don't think I'd be doing the same thing that I am now. And I guess I just have something to do here in the West. I really believe that Tulkus are, they're the preservers of. They help to preserve the tradition, but they also help tradition they help tradition to survive over the times, I think.
Yes.
And in order to do that, I think that tradition does have to adapt.
Yeah.
If you look at what His Holiness the 17th Karmapa is doing,
yes.
Of really transforming in many ways from within the tradition. This is really bringing it sort of up to date, so that it's still applicable and it can survive. I think that that this is one of the roles of Tulkus.
Great, that's a great answer, because that's a huge question at the moment.
Yeah.
As Buddhism enters the West, and how does tradition transform and maintain authenticity And Tulkus have a role in that.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying. Yeah.
And I think that Tulku is one. I think it's become part of our role. Is we have this. Well, we don't have always have the authority to do it, but a lot of us. I mean, we're people listen to us, people respect us, so long as we're behaving in a respectful manner, and in respectable manner in particular. But what our work is, so to speak, in
how that looks,
how we relate to the tradition, and to sort of and how we relate to the world. We are in sort of in these what would you call it? Sort of in some ways translators. So we're translating tradition. To people that nowadays, especially to sometimes to people who aren't interested in these really heavy duty sort of traditional Buddhist.
So it's well above and beyond learning another language, taking another form.
Yeah, well, that's it. And so in the end, we kind of are bridges. His Holiness the Dalai Lama once told me that he saw me as a bridge between two cultures, really, Tibetan culture and Western cultures. And it's kind of how I've tried to live my life, in sort of bridging a gap, and trying to help these two cultures understand each other in some ways. Perhaps now I'm doing more of I'm maybe helping. I don't know. Maybe I'm helping Western culture understand Tibetan culture better. But I have no idea right now. But it's just this idea of I really think that tulkus are in many ways meant to help adapt the tradition while keeping the tradition whole. If the world's major religions didn't answer questions concerning the environment, then a lot of people would turn away from that.
Yes.
And so they have to tackle that topic. But this is a topic that's relatively recent. In an evolving time, in an evolving context, religions need to evolve as well. And I think that in Tibetan Buddhism, at least, that is part of the role of a tulku.
Like you mentioned, His Holiness the Karmapa and his concern around, he's tackling those issues, environment, vegetarianism,
gender equality.
Yeah. So, that's very much a tulku Rinpoche.
Well, if he were just a regular teacher, I don't know that he would have the same clout.
Yeah. No, it's very true.
So it's wonderful that he's doing that. I think it's wonderful, and at the same time, he has the perfect, sort of status and position and knowledge in order to be able to do that. He has the permission to do that. He has the permission to do that.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And it makes a lot of sense as we walk through your life, talking about authorized lives, the choice to go into Western academia, get a Harvard PhD. I love to talk about your time at Sarah as well, but maybe it's a good segue to Western academic stuff. And so was that sort of your thinking around, this idea of being a bridge? And is that
actually,
sort of
yes, it was. It was exactly that. When I left Sarah, I wasn't planning on going to religious studies at all. I was hoping to, at first I was hoping to I was thinking, I had spoken with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala just prior to leaving India. And he actually told me that I should go into psychology.
Wow.
He said he thought it was a good thing for me to leave the monastery at the time. He said he was totally okay with it. But he said, don't waste your life. Go to university, study, and get a degree. And he said psychology. Originally, he said like that you'll be able to help many people. And when I got back to Canada, because of spending 6 years from age 14 to 20 in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery in India, the psychology department wasn't that interested.
They didn't want some debating?
No, maybe the philosophy department might have been a little bit more interested, but no. so they weren't really interested, and and there were a lot of other requirements that I didn't have at the time, I had never done statistics, for example, and you needed to have in order to do psych, you had to have statistics and things like that, and so I couldn't go into the psych department at the University of Quebec when I got back. But the idea was I did want to get a degree and teach somehow. And it was just this drive. And a friend of mine was in the religious studies department, and he said, "Well, you could probably just get into the religious studies department. You don't need statistics or anything to get into there." And so I got into the religious studies department at the University of Quebec and did my bachelor's. There, and had to learn the Western academic way of doing things as compared to the traditional. Traditional Tibetan or traditional Geluk way of doing things.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because it's something that fascinates me. And so, what do you have any stories about coming to Western academia and being confronted with the difference?
Sure. Well, for one, the teaching, I find the teaching style is different, right? It's a different teaching style, and I don't remember having so many questions in class in the monastery. But I think that the oddest thing for me was, maybe not the strangest, but it was just this I remember a strange sort of feeling of trying to wrap my head around this other way of doing things. For example, we would read these texts by major thinkers in the study of religion, and so I would read them, and I was so used to memorizing that I would memorize passages just naturally. I would be memorizing passages, and then we would have an exam, and I would just write it just verbatim how it was coming, and then having to put it into my own words was almost difficult.
How interesting!
Figure out how to put it into my own words, and so in many ways, the training that I received at the monastery actually was very helpful. It was very helpful to my education in university, but it really was a different system. It really is a different system, and you don't have to have devotion to your teacher in the university, whereas in the monastery, you're studying with someone also because you have profound respect and devotion for that person. It's not just because they're these renowned scholars within the monastery. Right? I think another aspect was I had a teacher in the monastery that teased me tremendously. Yeah. He really loved to tease me. He himself was a disciple of my predecessor, and so he had known my predecessor a little bit, and though he was a young monk at the time, and actually that was Geshe Ligden from Sarah, and he regularly he would ask a question in class, and he would put out a question, and he would say, "Okay, let's see if you're really the reincarnation of Geshe Jetsu." and if I responded in a way that wasn't quite correct, he would say, "I knew it. I knew it couldn't be true." But if I responded correctly, then he would say, "We'll see next time." So he would always sort of tease me with that, and he was absolutely lovely as a teacher. He was great. He actually said, when I went to ask him to become my teacher, he said, "Okay," but he said, "Okay, I'll be his teacher, but I don't want to see him until he speaks Tibetan."
Wow.
So he didn't want to see me until I could understand Tibetan, because he didn't want to...
How long did it take you to learn Tibetan?
Fluently 9 months.
9 months?
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yeah. I was going to debate, one of my other teacher, Geshe Karma Sonam, he had me come to class immediately, like the next day after I had asked him, and it was surprising. I didn't know what was going on when I was asked to come. So I went, and actually, he was teaching me, and he would just basically would say, just repeat, just say what I'm, these are the responses. This is how you. But he had a real thick Kampa accent, and so the debate, when they ask a question, and then. One of the responses is tamadru, and instead of tamadru, he would say domadra. And so I would spurt out as this little Western, this young 14-year-old Western boy saying domadra. So everyone thought that was really fun. But he actually he spoke to my home to my home teacher, the person who was also taking care of me, Kishitobe Pelge, and he told him to send me to debate about 4 months after I got to the monastery. So 3-4 months after I got to the monastery, I was in debates. Wow. And I had no idea what was going on.
And you were actually involved or watching?
I was involved.
Wow.
I mean, they were asking me questions, and I just had, and plus the whole, this is the new Western factor. Yeah, so I wasn't the only Westerner, but I wasn't the only Westerner there. There were other Westerners there. But I was the latest Westerner, and I was the first Western Tulku to be there. And
you were the first Western Geluk Tulku?
I was the first Western Geluk Tulku.
Wow. Yeah.
And so here I am. It's like the novelty of the monastery. Yeah. So everyone's coming around to check me out and ask questions and see what's going on. And in the beginning, when you're in a debate courtyard, it's such a cacophony of sounds and and clapping and yelling and and everything, and the and everything, all of that is going on, and it's hard to focus. It's hard to hear what the person in front of you is saying. You eventually you get used to it, and you're able to really use selective hearing. Yeah, But at that time, in the beginning, it was I wouldn't say intimidating. It was it was really exciting at the same time, but not knowing enough Tibetan to understand that was intimidating. But I did pick it up fast because of that.
9 months. Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah,
maybe some help from previous bakchaks.
Probably. Now I'm carrying about a bunch of bakchaks. So the I think the going from the traditional Tibetan Buddhist monastic setting, where I was studying 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and that was considered normal. Coming to a Western academic setting in Montreal, as a young man, and sort of felt like I was being parachuted there as well, and where you're studying less hours and you don't really know how to do it. None of my immediate family had been to university. Yeah. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. My mother was doing her bachelor's in teaching English as a second language at the time, but my father had never been to university or anything, and so they didn't really know how to navigate. No one explained it to me, so I had to kind of figure it out on my own in many ways. But it was interesting.
Yeah, and imagine you would have felt quite different in the monastery, and then also quite different in Western academy.
I felt different. Yeah, I felt pretty different everywhere I went.
Yeah,
it was the Western factor when I was there, and when I came back, it was the having been in a monastery factor. And in the beginning, it was a little bit difficult because there were people, people would ask me, "So, what do you do? Where are you from and stuff? So what do you do?" And I would say, "Well, I actually just got back from India. I was living there in a Tibetan Buddhist monastery for 6 years." And they'd be like, "Oh, I think someone's calling me."
Yeah, that's a conversation stopper. Right?
Yeah,
you were no longer a monk at this time, is that right?
In the beginning I was. I remained a monk, and then I gave back my vows.
So you were wearing robes at university?
I wasn't wearing robes at university, no, because it just would have caused too much confusion and too much attention as well. But when I kept because of these experiences of people, of the conversation stoppers, of people leaving when I told them, when I would tell them who I was, what I'd been doing and everything, I actually stopped talking about it. I felt that I had to keep it to myself. I didn't want to talk too much about it. And so my closest friends only found out relatively late on, when I was able to take a Buddhism class. I took Intro to Buddhism at the University of Quebec, and I remember the professor would occasionally ask me to explain things, and he would say, someone would have a question, and he would sort of return the question to me, defer to me, and say, well, what do you think? And I would answer him, and I remember my fellow students looking at me like, how does he know so much about Buddhism?
The professor knew.
And the professor knew. The professor knew, but the students were looking at me, and they're like, why does he know? And then a couple of them came up to me and was like, how do you know so much about Buddhism? How is it? This is an Intro to Buddhism. We've never taken this class before, and how come you know so much? And so I explained it to them, and
he said, I've been studying Buddhism for lives.
That's pretty much it. So that's how they got, they got brought into my inner circle, so to speak. So really standing out, actually, I learned very quickly, even as a young child, that standing out was not necessarily the best thing for me. Even health-wise, it wasn't the best thing. I was often sort of ridiculed, or even sometimes physically attacked in school as a child, because one of my quick story about my childhood. I went to a school called FACE, Fine Arts Core Education, in Montreal. It was a great school. And I had a wonderful teacher named Jim Stiller, and we were in class. We had what we called homeroom, and so we were in homeroom. We had one teacher for a number of students, and we would do things in this homeroom. So we had art projects, or we had sometimes we learned square dancing at one point, and so all of these little things. Stuff, it was really neat. It really was. The school had a very strong fine arts focus. So dance, theater, plastic arts, and music. And so we were in homeroom, and we had an assignment. We had to do a drawing of our favorite place in the whole world. As a child, I've seen so many. So we had to do this drawing, and then we sat in a circle, and we each had to describe the place, explain what it was, and explain why it was our favorite place. And I drew the Potala Palace.
Wow.
I drew the Potala Palace in Lhasa, and so it goes around and around. People are like, "Oh, this is my uncle's farm, in the Laurentian Mountains, and this is this." And we get to meet. This is the Potala Palace in Lhasa, and it's my favorite place because that's where the Dalai Lamas live.
How old were you?
I was probably jeepers. I was about 8, I think. In 8 or so, I was probably
That would mark you down as the weird kid. That's for sure.
I think my parents got called often.
Oh my gosh!
So I learned very quickly that standing out wasn't always the best thing.
Yes.
And in some ways that sort of made me sort of push aside for a long time, sort of not neglect, but just not sort of allow too much to come out, the whole Tulku side of things. And in fact, it wasn't until I applied at Harvard that I applied to Harvard. Sorry, it wasn't until I applied to Harvard that I felt that I could really allow that allow that side of me to express itself.
As you were applying, or then as you were
I was taking, as I being here, taking classes, talking with people, I felt that I finally felt that I could, I could allow that side of me out.
So you didn't feel a need to be objective or
Well, I knew I did understand the need to be objective and to question tradition. That I've always understood, and like I said, I think it's part of our role as Tulkus in some ways, is to question the tradition. Is this still adapted to today, to modern times? But there's also that I did a BA and a master's, so I have a bachelor of arts in religious studies from the University of Quebec, and I have a master's in Tibetan studies from INATCO in Paris, and then after that I came to the States, to Harvard. So I had the academic background by then, and for me, it's never really been a problem to really sort of step outside my own skin or step outside my own tradition and look at the tradition. And that's kind of what I do with the book, actually.
Yes.
So as I'm stepping out, and I'm part of this tradition, yet I'm taking a look at it in a different way.
It's an interesting methodology in a way. Like you're well and truly in it, and just to step back from it. Did at Harvard, and did your concept of yourself as a Tulku change at all, or did that process? Like I imagine at the monastery, being a Tulku, a privileged position, and then being in academia, it seemed to be, at first it was maybe problematic. You kept it to yourself, and then at Harvard you felt the need. You felt that you could express that. Did your concept or understanding of the way you embodied that change at all, or has it been pretty?
I don't really know. I think I don't really know that it's changed per se. I think it's just more of the fact that I started to live as both a Tulku and an academic.
Yes.
And in many ways, it's kind of been this strange situation throughout my entire life. I in 2009 I taught the infamous Intro to Buddhism class, not at Harvard, but at the University of Quebec. So my old alma mater, I actually returned there for that. And I was faced with this question of, okay, well, here I am, the insider, speaking of it, almost as an outsider. So what does it mean for the whole insider-outsider debate that went on for so long in the study of religion? I'm an insider, so I guess technically I can't be a true outsider. But at the same time, here I am looking at this tradition from a very sort of academic perspective and calling into question sort of received ideas and that are present within the tradition. And how do you strike that balance between being a teacher of Buddhism as an academic topic and being a teacher of Buddhism as a religion?
Yeah. And you seem to have definitely, like you could have easily went into the Dharma scene and, and been a teacher in America, Canada, Europe, in the Dharma scene, but it seems you've made the definite decision to do it in an academic setting.
I had.
And what was the?
I had made that decision.
Oh, is it changed?
It's changed.
It's changed. Okay. Well,
It's that is something I find throughout my life, is that every time I seem to make a decision, say, okay, this is where I definitely have to go, something comes along and pushes me into a whole new direction, so. I am both in academia and at the same time, I teach meditation in France, and
at
actually not at a Dharma center. I have my own space that I teach at because I don't want to be in relation to a Dharma center or anything.
Okay.
So, in France, it's a very sort of what would be the word? Particular situation with the separation of church and state in France. Their secularism is very, very strong. In fact, there's no actual word to describe it because the USA is considered a secular country. France is much, much more secular. So church and state are so strictly separate that there is no official there is no official government definition of the term religion, and there's no official French government definition of the term cult either.
Oh, really?
Because it's religion,
that's not
so
that space.
it's not that space. There is no, or very little at least, teaching of religions in public schools. Even in universities, it's very hard to find now. Even though it used to be this world center for teaching religions and learning about religions. So because of this, a lot of people, because of the situation, people are very wary of religions, and a lot of people are really not interested in traditional sort of religious approaches. Yet they're very interested in cultivating the mind, and to the degree that what that means to them.
Yes.
So what I do actually is I teach academically, but then on once in a while I'll also do teachings. I also teach meditation sessions, just basic shine. But I translate it in a way, or I present it in a way that's remains. It remains faithful to the tradition, but it's not using the exact same expressions.
Yeah.
So if you take the word devotion, for example, that for many people is a big turnoff. So I don't use devotion. I'll use, trust, confidence, but I'll develop it even further so that they understand what the term actually means. And it does get close to devotion, just I'm not using that term anymore.
Yeah. Well, that is the bridge.
So that is the bridge. So now I am actually kind of feel like I'm bridging.
Yes.
And much more than I was. I originally thought that academia was going to be my lifelong place. That was what I was going to do. And I didn't want anything to do with Dharma centers or Dharma teaching. I wanted to teach Buddhism academically. And in the past few years, that has shifted.
It seems like in theory that sounds good, but in practice it's a little bit more.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think there, for example, you notice now that there are also a lot of practitioners who are studying academically, and they're bringing together these two worlds. The recent, even the translation and transmission conference that happened recently. That was an interesting experience as well, because here we have practitioners with the academics, and they're coming together.
Melting pot, wasn't it?
It was an interesting melting pot.
Great. Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time as well. I know you have to run. So maybe I just thought we'd finish with talking about your new book, Authorized Lives, biography and the early formation of Geluk identity. One of the issues it tackles is the representation of Tsongkhapa and his relationship with Manjushri. So do you want to give a bit of a spoiler? Not a spoiler, but what's happening there? Like...
Well, it was basically today, in traditional context, Tsongkhapa is always portrayed as an emanation of Manjushri. But if you look at his biographies, you find these two trends, these two explanations. Tsongkhapa was, he was an emanation of Manjushri, but he also propitiated Manjushri. And I think a lot of people find that hard to sort of comprehend. And originally myself included, and so the standard response to that was, well, you have to look at it in terms of, sort of conventional and ultimate truths, and and all that. So Tsongkhapa, the idea behind it is that Tsongkhapa was ultimately an emanation of Manjushri, and but he, I guess you could say, pretended in some ways, conventionally propitiated Manjushri so that he was showing his disciples what they needed to do, how it was important, right?
An interesting use of ultimate, right?
Yeah. and so, I had, growing up in the Gelugpa tradition, I had taken that for granted. For me, it was just, that's the way it was. And then I was reading through Tsongkhapa's biographies, and I'm thinking, wow, here's an interesting little thing. In his earliest biographies, he's never portrayed as an emanation of Manjushri, or almost never portrayed. And from the earliest biographies that we have, if had there been, I would love to have had others access to it. It would have been wonderful to see, to compare. But there is a shift in figurations of Tsongkhapa, and there are actually two traditions that come together and give us the presentation, the figuration that we have now of Tsongkhapa. And so the first part of the book that looks at these, well, actually the first and second in some ways, look at these two, how these two trends eventually come, you see them come together. But originally they were two separate, distinct traditions.
Interesting. And also you discovered like the Yikcha of Sarah J it had changed. And was it related to that?
Yeah. There's at least this is what I think. I mean, as research goes on, I'm sure, there are other things will come up, and, it will come to nuance my findings. But I think that in the end, there's this movement. There's a sort of movement to promote Geluk.
Yes, Geluk.
It's the rise of Geluk. It's to come to promote Geluk as, as the second foremost disciple of Tsongkhapa, and he eclipses some other disciples who were there way before he was. And the interesting thing is that it's the promotion of Tsongkhapa as an emanation of Manjushri is happening in the same texts that are promoting Geluk as a disciple of Manjushri, and as Tsongkhapa's chief disciple or second chief disciple. And this is in the end seems quite closely related to things that were going on philosophically and I think politically at Sera, in the 16th century.
Yeah.
As I said, it remains. There. I think further study will probably nuance this view. Maybe even contradict. You never know. But from what I've seen so far, everything seems to point in this direction, which makes it interesting because it shows that biography really is something that biography does something.
Yes.
It's not just writing about someone's life. There are many decisions, choices, and even omissions become extremely important in a text when they're placed in relation to other texts. And the author of a biography, in the end, can acquire some status or legitimacy through the way a biography is written and then read.
Yeah. So it's more than just the story and the biography.
It's more than just the story.
Relating it to other things.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you said. What is omitted can tell us a lot.
Yeah.
Sort of what you're finding.
Exactly. Yeah. And these are things that I think haven't been looked at as much as they could. I think in when we're studying Tibetan biography, and Jen has done some tremendous work. Jen Gyatso has done tremendous work with biography, and having her as my advisor was just as my main advisor was wonderful because she's such an innovative thinker in this direction. But when you look at a lot of the scholarship on biography that has been done, or that had been done until I wrote my dissertation, I actually never really saw any of it saying, well, we have to take into account, we have to take into account the decisions that the biographer is actually making. And these are things that you look at, that you find in Western biographical studies. Is the place of the biographer, the voice of the biographer, the choices that the biographer is making. And so one of the things that I hope that this book will bring out also is to encourage people to do, perhaps I should say, is to start trying to look at biography a little bit differently, and in looking for the omissions and saying, oh, well, suddenly this disappears. Why does it disappear? Why does the author think that this should be omitted? And then looking at in more detail, going into an idea of, why does a biographer arrange things in a very specific order? That's another thing that we don't really look at.
Yes.
And hence the comparison between the two Geluk biographies that I have in the book is meant to help people to do just that, to see the difference in the structure and how one author really structures the biography differently than the other.
Why?
And then you start to think, okay, well, why does he do that?
There's an agenda here. Or
Yes.
different contexts and political reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this book really gives another dimensions to the Namta, really.
Well, that's what I hope, and it's also a foray into a time period that not many people have studied so far, the early development of the Gelugpa tradition, and it wasn't what I was planning on doing originally for my dissertation. So it's
a bit like your life, right?
Exactly. But there aren't that many books that actually look at that particular time in Gelugpa history, and so I hope that it'll help to clarify, to see the Gelugpa tradition also maybe less as a monolithic entity and more as something that's developed over time, and that there were shifts, and it's normal for shifts to happen within any kind of tradition or any kind of social group, really.
Yeah, no, and I see this very much, the idea of the bridging, and this is sort of the part of that work as well, I'm sure.
Well, I hope so.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was really fascinating.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Wisdom Podcast. We're a new podcast, and so it'd really help us if you like what you heard, if you will go onto iTunes and give us a rating. And don't forget, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. Next on the Wisdom Podcast, we have Bhikkhu Bodhi joining us. We're so excited to have one of the world's most respected Buddhist translators join us. His translations of the Pali Canon is really considered the gold standard.
I didn't actually learn translation from anybody. And I didn't start off with the intention to become a translator. It's just that when I started to learn Pali, I would be comparing the Pali text with the translations coming from the Pali Text Society. And I couldn't understand I could understand the Pali more easily than I could understand the translations from the Pali Text Society, because they were written in a kind of Victorian style of English. Almost as though they were imitating the style of the King James version of the Bible.